We all know how it goes. Most stories usually have a good guy and a bad guy, and while we always root for the hero, we usually love, or in some cases absolutely despise, watching the villain until they inevitably get what's coming to them. That pretty much sums it all up, doesn't it? Well, not exactly. Recently, I've noticed this trend where people keep screaming and screaming for more complex and even sympathetic villains, especially in superhero movies. And the thing is, I completely disagree with that notion. I believe the more evil and petty a villain is, the better it is for the overall story. But before we can discuss why I believe that is, there are a few things we must go over first. And spoilers for any number of live action or animated movies may abound. So if I bring up something that you don't want anything revealed about, you might want to skip over that part. This will be your only warning. Alright, so to start at the very beginning, what exactly is the purpose of the villain in the first place? And the simple answer is to cause conflict or a problem for the hero. No matter how important they actually are to the story, the villain must cause direct problems for the hero, or they're not a villain, plain and simple. Now, usually the villain does hold some thematic significance as well, but that's not necessarily a requirement. Now, another reason the villain is usually the bad guy is because it's their job to do something that's morally wrong so that the writer can show you why what they're doing is wrong. Please keep that in mind for later in the video. But again, that's not necessarily a requirement of them either. Okay, so the question then becomes, how much is the villain an actual character versus a plot device? Well, that depends entirely on the writer and how important they feel the character is to the story. But obviously, most of the time, they want the character to be something more than just something to push the narrative forward, and for most people, that's where the desire for complex villains comes in. Because they believe if they don't have complex or complicated reasons for what they're doing, then they're just a one dimensional plot device. Because after all, nobody in real life is ever evil or wants money and power just for the sake of it, right? Well, here's the thing. Sometimes they are. Sometimes people are just greedy, selfish jerks, and there really is no reason why they do what they do other than because they have no conscience and that's what they want to do. And let me give you the perfect example of that. Tommy DeVito and Jimmy Conway in Goodfellas. Now, Tommy has absolutely no reason to be in the mob and going on killing sprees other than because he wants to. You get to see in black and white. His mother is the nicest person on earth and he has a good home. In short, he's just a man who wants to do bad things because he enjoys doing them. And as Hill describes in narration, Conway is exactly the same way. He's just a man who wants to make as much money as possible and doesn't care how he gets it. He even takes pride in being thought of as the bad guy. And he has no complex reason for all of this. He's just greedy, and that's the end of it. And please do note that their depictions in the movie were said to be very accurate to the real life people they were based on. In fact, those two characters have even been used in schools as the perfect references for the behavior of psychopaths and sociopaths. And what they'll also say is that people like them will usually join the mob because it can get them ahead faster than living honestly, and in the case of psychopaths, allows them to do all the horrible, sadistic things they want to do without having to pay the consequences for it. Look to Reservoir Dogs for another example of that. Or, to use another real life example, let's take the forgotten 1948 movie He Walked by Night. Based off an actual case of an extremely intelligent man who committed dozens of successful robberies and killed a cop, even the movie at one point wonders what drove him to this point. Take a listen for yourself.
What went on in his mind? Why had he set his hand against his fellow men, taken the life of another, of a stranger, of a man who was merely doing his duty?
And here's the thing. That question is never answered. All he wants is money and seems to want to get it by any dishonest means possible. And multiple times it's brought up how gifted he is with electricity. He easily could have gotten himself any number of high paying jobs, but he's not interested in any of that. Throughout the movie, he's portrayed as nothing but an extremely cold, calculating, and unfeeling man that'll do anything for a profit and avoid capture. And why he's that way is never once brought up. There are subtle hints that it might have to do with his time in the army, but nothing's ever established for certain. And if you ask me, it's all the better for it. The ambiguity, that cold, inhuman look in his eye, it makes him much scarier than portraying him as a mentally disturbed army veteran or something similar. At one point, an officer even describes him as pieces of a face belonging to a man that never existed. And that's exactly how he feels, even when you as the audience get to see him and know he's very real. And lastly, he killed a man in cold blood. What redeeming qualities can, or even should, a man really have after committing such an act? Now, you're probably wondering, what's my point with all of this? That people don't always have complicated reasons for doing what they do. People don't always have complex philosophies to justify their actions. Sometimes people really are evil just for the sake of it, or just so greedy and amoral that they don't care how they get what they want so long as they get it. So why shouldn't people like that be the villains of stories? Half the time they are in real life, so isn't it only logical that they would be in fiction as well? I mean, there is a time and place for more sympathetic and complex villains. Some of them are even among the best of all time. Don't get me wrong. But on the whole, I believe it's better to portray them the other way. Because on the whole, I think that more often leads to better, yet no less realistic villains. In fact, let's even use a couple of examples of that. Take Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. Now, he's a complete self-obsessed narcissist, and that's about all there is to him. Yet, I have no doubt plenty of people would tell you they know people just like him in real life, and he's also considered among the best Disney villains. And Scar, he is the absolute definition of a sociopath. He has no excuse for his behavior, and he doesn't care. There's no complex reason for what he does, and yet he could absolutely exist in real life. And he's also considered one of Disney's best villains. And then we have somebody like Judge Claude Frollo. Now, he has very complex reasons for his actions, ones you see way too often in real life, as a matter of fact. So he could very much exist in the real world. People like him have, and is also considered an excellent villain. But you notice that he's really the only villain to have those distinctions. Really, any other time Disney has tried to make their villains complex, it hasn't worked, while sticking with the more basic but no less realistic evil, greedy, and petty formula usually does. But this is by no means exclusive to animation. Take Noah Cross, who I once saw labeled as the most deplorable fictional character ever put to film. And honestly, I still don't think that does enough to describe this awful man. I'm even ashamed to have to put this filth on your screen. Now, what's his motivation? Money. Pure profit. And because doing evil things gives him a thrill. His excuses fall flat, his attempts to justify his actions don't even fool himself, and in the end, he's basically just an unapologetic demon incarnate thinking about the future. There's no complex moral thinking in there, just an evil, psychotic, selfish, hedonistic, greedy pound of flesh with the heart of a dead pig. And yet, I don't think anybody watching this could honestly tell me that people like him don't exist in real life, because they have. And that's one of the reasons why Chinatown is considered one of the best movies ever made, because of its hard realism. And its villain doesn't have to be complex to achieve that. Just humanity at its absolute worst. But on a slightly lighter topic, Just because a villain doesn't have complex motivations doesn't mean they also can't be fun to watch either. Like Hans Gruber, every action movie fan's dream villain, and he's just an intelligent man trying to get rich quick. Even the other characters are surprised that all he wants is money, but he's still considered one of the greatest villains of all time. Or even the Terminator, who literally has nothing beyond its programming, and yet is still excellent and one of my all-time favorites. Or fictional monsters like the Xenomorphs from the Alien franchise or the Thing from The Thing. They're intelligent, they want to kill everybody. That's it. And the exact same goes for the shark in Jaws. They're all about the most basic a villain can get, and yet we still talk about them over 40 years later. Or Hannibal Lecter. Labeled the greatest villain of all time by the AFI, Lecter's just an insane killer with absolutely no rationale for his actions, and even he knows it. You never find out what's going on in that head of his, and you honestly don't want to. And finally, the Emperor from Star Wars. You could give me a 12-hour show about him 7 days a week, and I'd sit through every minute of it. Perhaps my favorite villain ever, this man is literally the embodiment of evil. Wants power just for the sake of it, is unapologetically evil because he loves being evil, and a pure sadist who will make anybody who goes against him pay, and pay hard. And yet, you can't help but love watching him every moment he's on screen. If you ask me, he is absolutely everything you could ever want or ask for in a villain. He has no redeeming qualities, and he doesn't need them. He doesn't need complexity or complicated philosophies to justify his actions. In fact, I think that's part of the reason he works so effectively, is because he lacks those very things. Besides, Star Wars already has a complex villain and handles his character just as brilliantly at that. However, complexity is by no means a bad thing. As I said before, some of the best villains of all time were very complex ones, like Roy Batty, for instance. You feel for him, and his philosophies fit in perfectly with the movie's themes. But honestly, I think one of the best uses of complexity I've ever seen was actually the hint or implication of it without directly showing it. And that's Immortant Joe from Mad Max Fury Road. Another personal favorite of mine, Immortant Joe seems like your typical cool action movie villain who revels in his position and power over others, sees everybody as his property to use as he so chooses, and will never stop until he gets what he wants. And the mask and voice also gives him quite a few points, let's face it. But one of my favorite scenes with him might just be right after he's gotten the news that his perfect in every way son didn't survive. And while everybody around him takes a moment to mourn the child, he just stares off into the distance with this blank look on his face. Now, I really only came to realize this after reading a bunch of YouTube comments on the subject, but the brilliance of that scene comes from his lack of reaction, rather than him screaming in rage or something like that. He could be completely indifferent to their deaths, or in his own twisted way, he may actually care about both of them, and that is just his way of coping. But the thing is, we'll never know what he was thinking, and thus his reaction will mean something different to every person watching it. In other words, in this case, it's the idea of complexity rather than outright depicting it that enhances his character. Now, another thing I feel a lot of people don't consider is most movies are supposed to be the hero's story, not the villain's. If you want to make a complex villain, sometimes you're running the risk that the audience might become more invested in the person they're supposed to be rooting against than the person they should be rooting for. And in addition to that, the villain could also end up taking too much time away from the hero, making their story feel incomplete as a result. Now, that doesn't always happen, far from it. But let me just say, I can understand why sometimes writers opt for villains with simpler motivations. And as I've said before, just because a motivation is simple doesn't mean it isn't realistic. But the thing is, complex villains can also lead to an even bigger issue. As I mentioned at the start, most of the time the villain will do something morally wrong because the writer wants to establish why that thing they're doing is wrong. But if their motivations are too sympathetic, or if their arguments for why they're doing what they're doing are too good, then you end up sending the wrong message to the audience. And one of the best examples I can give for that is Thanos from Avengers Infinity War. And please do note, I will only be discussing the one from Infinity War. No other Thanoses apply here. Okay, now before you start an angry riot, listen. Thanos is a well-written villain. I don't think that's the problem. I'll freely admit, he's a well-written villain. What I do think the issue is that people have too much respect for him. I mean, he states his case so well that at one point I almost started taking his side. You know, he preaches about honor, hates lying, shows respect for people he deems worthy opponents, and his motivation comes from survivor's guilt and a desire to save the universe from what happened to his planet. But here's the thing. He's still a man that won't let go of the past, is trying to kill half the universe to prove people who've been dead for possibly thousands of years that he was right, is openly sadistic, and takes visible pleasure in torturing and killing people, never fights fair, refuses to listen to anyone's counterarguments, no matter how much sense they make and how calmly they try to talk to him, and feels it's his place to take away the lives of trillions. Listen, no matter how you frame it, no matter how honorable or sympathetic he comes across, this man does not deserve respect. When you take a step back and really look at his motivations, they are very petty, which nobody ever calls him out on. And if somebody like him were to exist in the real world, which they most certainly could, you can guarantee he'd be in a straitjacket, or at the very least in jail. And yet, there are many people out there that say they do respect him, even if they don't agree with him, and I honestly think that's a problem. And I believe that even the writers bought into that a little too much, which I think led to narrative choices that led to the detriment of the story's second part. But that's a video for another day. I guess my main point with all of this is, just because a villain isn't complex doesn't mean they aren't realistic and that they still can't be good ones. As I stated before, some of the best villains of all time had the most basic of motivations. And listen, I don't have a problem with complex villains. I really don't. There are too many great ones out there for me to list here. I'm just tired of people saying that a villain is one-dimensional and unrealistic if they don't have some complicated philosophy or reason for what they do. Because as I pointed out before, that's obviously not true, and injecting unneeded complexity into a villain can end up doing more harm than good. And not to mention, I don't see anything wrong with a bad guy that's just fun to watch and gives you immense satisfaction when they finally get what's coming to them. Because more often than not, with complex villains, you either end up feeling too sorry for them to want to see them get their punishment, and if they redeem themselves and live, you might very well feel like they haven't paid enough for their actions. So it's also a very tricky road to go down. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. And now it's your turn to tell me. Do you like complex villains, or do you prefer when they have simpler motivations? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And remember, if you disagree with me, that's fine. We all have our preferences when it comes to our favorite villains, and I'm willing to respect yours if you're willing to respect mine. So, thank you all for watching. It is very much appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.